Delegates from all 13 states gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to write the U.S. Constitution. But they found themselves arguing over many issues. The biggest of their challenges was their disagreement over whether big and small states would have equal power in the new U.S. government. My name is Dr. Rick Gardiner from Columbus State University, and this is a Muscogee County School District podcast, The U.S. Constitution. In 1787, there were only 13 states in the United States. But these 13 states were not equal in terms of population. Some of them had larger populations. These were referred to as the large or the big states, such as Virginia and New York. Others had relatively much smaller populations, and these were referred to as the small states. Rhode Island and Delaware were considered smaller states. Under the first U.S. Constitution, which was called the Articles of Confederation, each of the states was considered equal and had equal power and influence in the United States government. The question that the writers of the new Constitution had to answer was whether that equality was fair. If Virginia had 4 times more citizens than Rhode Island, shouldn't Virginia have more influence in the making of U.S. laws? The question was, in fact, most crucial in terms of lawmaking power, or in other words, with respect to the legislative branch of the government. The big question came down to this: how many legislators should each state get to send to the United States Congress? Now, under the Articles of Confederation, each state got 1 equal vote in the Congress. But the big states were no longer willing to continue that system. The first proposal was made by the delegates from Virginia. The Virginia plan was that the number of legislators from each state should be determined by a census of the population of the state. The larger the state, the more legislators they deserved. The delegates from the smaller states were strongly opposed to the Virginia plan, and if it were written into the Constitution, some of the state's delegates were prepared to walk out in protest. The counter-proposal came from the New Jersey delegation. Their plan was basically to keep the same system for Congress that had been written in the Articles of Confederation. Each state gets 1 vote. But the Virginians continued to insist upon their numerical dominance. For a while, it looked like they were at an impasse, and as a result, the project could collapse without any constitution being written. A compromise was devised by a delegate from Connecticut named Roger Sherman. In history, we call this the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. Here's what Sherman proposed. The legislative branch of the government should be divided into 2 sections, much like the British government had been for hundreds of years. In Britain, their legislative branch, called the Parliament, included a House of Commons, whose members were elected by the citizens, but also a House of Lords, whose members inherited their seats from their fathers and whose powers were slightly stronger. In Britain, all laws passed through both houses before they're adopted. Sherman believed that having 2 houses, like the British, would be a great idea. The fancy name for this idea is a bicameral legislature. Instead of a House of Commons and a House of Lords, the names the Americans would give to their 2 houses would be the House of Representatives and the Senate. Like the House of Lords, the Senate's powers would be slightly stronger, but unlike the British, there would be no inherited seats. the Americans believed that their legislators should somehow have to earn a seat in either house of Congress. If there were two separate sections of Congress, Sherman believed that the argument between the big and the small states could be solved. In the more powerful of the houses, that is, in the Senate, each state would have exactly equal representation. 2 members, 2 votes from every state. In the lower house, the House of Representatives, the number of representatives would be determined by the population of each state. A census would need to be taken every 10 years or so to see how many people lived in each state. And for every 30,000 people, each state would be allowed 1 representative. Like the British Parliament, all laws would need to be approved by both houses. Therefore, both the big and the small states would, in some sense, get their way. This great compromise was accepted, adopted, and written into the United States Constitution. And to this day, the legislative branch of the United States government includes a House of Representatives and a Senate. Now, the senators are considered more powerful for several reasons. First, there are less of them, so their individual powers are greater. Second, they serve for longer terms between elections. Senators serve for 6 years, while representatives in the House serve for just 2 years. Third, it's the Senate that has to give its consent to the choices of the president in terms of Supreme Court justices, members of the president's cabinet, and international treaties. And finally, it's the Senate that has the privilege of ultimately determining whether or not a president should be thrown out of office in the event of an impeachment. Thanks to Roger Sherman, the Constitutional Convention did not come to a screeching halt. The Great Compromise was adopted, and both the big and small states were somewhat satisfied. Though neither were delighted by it, it was the middle ground that was necessary, and as history has proven, it worked. There was, however, one kink in this plan. If the number of representatives from a state depended on the population of that state, what people should be included in the population? In particular, the question was whether Indians and slaves should count in a state's population. The question about Indians did not create as much problem. All states agreed to exclude Indians insofar as they were not taxpayers. The question of slaves, however, was harder to answer. States with large numbers of slaves wanted to be able to count their slaves as persons because that would give them more representation in Congress. The states that had very few slaves felt at a disadvantage. Again, Roger Sherman proposed a compromise that James Wilson helped him with, that not every slave should be counted, but only 6 out of every 10 slaves, or 3/5 of them. That gave slave-holding states a slight advantage in terms of population, but it clearly indicated that a slave did not count as a full U.S. citizen. This compromise, known as the 3/5 Compromise, may have prevented the Constitutional Convention from falling apart in 1787, but in 1857 it came back to cause even more trouble for the United States. Here's what happened. In the 1850s, a slave named Dred Scott escaped across state lines into a state where slavery was illegal. But then he was returned to his master back in the old state. Now, sympathetic lawyers appealed on Scott's behalf to the Supreme Court, saying that his constitutional rights had been violated. Well, the court looked at the Constitution, and on the grounds of the 3/5 Compromise, they determined that slaves are not full persons and therefore do not have civil rights of persons according to the U.S. Constitution. Well, that horrible decision, known as the Dred Scott decision, was largely the cause of John Brown's insurrection at Harper's Ferry in 1859, which was the prelude to the American Civil War. In other words, the Three-Fifths Compromise may have seemed expedient in 1787, but in the long run, it led to an even greater argument, and I mean a war. In our next podcast, we'll look at the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and see how the founders deliberately attempted to protect the citizens from being dominated by the government. My name is Dr. Richard Gardiner from Columbus State University, and this has been a Muscogee County School District podcast, the U.S. Constitution.